Running Aces Casino and Racetrack is the Twin Cities' premier choice for exciting entertainment, 24/7 gaming and dining, monthly comedy shows, and $1 blackjack with no commission or ante, making it the most player-friendly casino around. Trout Air Tavern at Running Aces offers Minnesota-inspired handcrafted dishes with locally sourced ingredients and the trout that made the area famous. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, 25 minutes north of downtown. Visit runaces.com. Running Aces, your night out is waiting. TCL is a proud sponsor of the 1500 ESPN studios. TCL, America's fastest growing TV brand.
For those who simply can't get enough talk about the Vikings, we present Bonus Chatter. Bonus chatter about your favorite team that's unscripted, unfiltered, and uninterrupted. This is another edition of 1500 ESPN's Purple Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Purple Podcast. Matthew Coller, along with Pro Football Focus analyst Eric Eager. Eric, how are you?
I'm well. How about you?
I am doing really well. And, though, I've had an interesting thought about the Vikings this week. As I've looked at some of our data, our analytics for how articles do, and I've found that the interest in the Minnesota Vikings from this fan base has just plummeted. And I don't mean from the Purple Podcast. All of you subscribers are still wonderful in listening to the podcast. But when it comes to the interest in, say, an article about how the Vikings match up with the Seattle Seahawks, no one seems to be interested in this game, Eric, because the fan base, and I put out a poll on this on Twitter, the fan base does not seem to be all in on this season in any way, shape, or form after that loss last week against New England, and really even going back to Chicago. So you tell me, is that a rational response for Vikings fans to look at what's happened over these last couple of games, especially the ones against good teams, and kind of bail out on this Vikings team until they prove otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because I think from the perspective of, historically, I think the Vikings fans have been, fairly, irrational about their team. But, I think I said this to you, if you're going to quit on this season as a fan, I don't necessarily know if any of the other subsequent seasons with Kirk are going to be any better.
So why is that with Cousins? I mean, we've talked about him a ton, about the numbers in Washington and what he's done so far this year, how good he's been, how they could support him better, and all that sort of stuff. But what I end up feeling like, Eric, with 4 seasons of this for his starting career, as the sample size grows, and it's always 500. Did you ever see that graphic, by the way?
Yes.
With the Washington football squad, where they were literally 500 all the time. It just win one, lose one, win one, lose one at any given point, like one game within 500. And the Vikings have been that same exact way this year, where you might get excited about a particular win, like against Green Bay, and the very next week, it's not there. And when I went back and looked at the tape, yes, John DeFilippo deserves a lot of criticism, but there were throws that were missed. In Chicago, there's a touchdown throw that goes over Stephon Diggs' head. There's yardage that's put up, but it's down a couple of scores and things like that. So, I mean, this has been a bit of the MO for Cousins for his entire career, is that it's 500. It's up and it's down all the time. And I guess I sympathize with Vikings fans, because a lot of times when you have a situation like this, it's like, okay, well, what could be next? What quarterback might you draft, or who could you sign, or who could you trade for, or something like that. But with this, if you don't like Kirk Cousins and you don't think he can get it done, you are here for the next 3 years. They're not going to make any changes at the quarterback position.
Right. I mean, that's the difficult part, because I think historically with Minnesota, you've always sort of seen, when they were, when they lost in 1998, there was still Moss and there was still that excitement. When they lost in 2000, even though it didn't necessarily actually work out for them, they still had Moss, they still had Carter, they had Culpepper had come onto the scene. In 2009, there did feel like the door was closing, but, Brett Favre was able to come back another season to help them out a little bit. And so this last year felt a little rough because you sort of knew that everything was lucky for them, right? Case Keenum playing well, a defense being number one overall, et cetera, et cetera. And what you end up seeing, though, is that, Vikings fans, I think, sort of saw the writing on the wall that getting Cousins was a desperation move. This was something that, I wouldn't say pretended to be excited about, but kind of pretended to be excited about. And then when it becomes pretty apparent that it's kind of a middling situation with him at the position, that's kind of their, the way that they've looked at it. And so, I think that there are always things they can do better. Obviously next season, they have to improve the offensive line. They have to, replace Sheldon Richardson most likely. They're getting a little older on the defensive front with Griffin and things like that. So I think that there's some things to be optimistic about, but I think the ceiling is inherently there with Cousins, and it's just those little things. It's just, not necessarily just being able to string a lot of things together consecutively, just, not having a ton of turnover where he plays, but always sort of interspersing them equally across his throws and not being able to sort of put together, being very characteristic of the Washington team with the win-loss. It's sort of like with his throws, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad.
Yeah, and game by game, I did a chart in an article of his Pro Football Focus grades for his entire career, and year by year, every line is very, very up and down, and, the better quarterbacks, it's usually more consistent, or even there are other quarterbacks who are so insanely hot or cold that, if you catch fire at one of those points, then maybe you have a chance, and I guess that's where I want to go with this, should they at least let this thing play out because there is always a chance. And I don't mean to sound like the Dumb and Dumber quote there. You're telling me there's a chance. But when I look at a team like this and I see how close they came at times to looking like a really competitive team in the NFC, for half a game against the Los Angeles Rams where they're right there, for half a game against Chicago where they're trying to come back and win. It's not like they lost these games. Even against New England, it's 10-10 in the fourth quarter. It's not like they lost these games 35-0. And I know that that's the nature of the NFL, but that's kind of the point, right? So the odds right now, Eric, look like they're pretty darn good for this team to get into the playoffs. Does this team have the potential and the quarterback have the potential to do something that would really surprise the fans who have kind of given up here?
Yeah, so if they end up being the fifth or sixth seed, they're likely in the NFC to face a Dallas team or a Chicago team in the first round of the playoffs. I do think that those are two teams that the Vikings can hang around with. What we've seen, though, is that if they get into the second round, the Rams are a team that I think are only getting better defensively, and obviously their offense was able to outrun the Vikings on the Thursday night in early October, and then the Saints, who did not play well against the Vikings, were still able to beat them by multiple scores. So, if I'm looking at, their possibilities this year, they're very bleak in the sense that, unlike a season ago, you do not get a home game, you do not get a bye. All the luck was sort of trending in their direction. And unfortunately, it was Philadelphia that was able to seize that from them last season, as opposed to the Vikings. And so I think that that's also sort of why, if you're thinking about, looking at this from the Vikings fan perspective, that's also why I think that the year's so down is that you sort of get it. You sort of know that to win a Super Bowl, you either have to be New England or you have to get lucky for an extended stretch. And the Vikings, I think, had, with the Minneapolis Miracle and so on and so forth, got their fair share of luck last year. And I think most Vikings fans would assume that that's sort of like not going to ever be bestowed upon them moving forward.
Yeah, it's not impossible to be that wild card seed and go on the road and run all the way through, but it doesn't happen a whole heck of a lot. And I think that it played really into Philadelphia's strengths that they were able to play at home for those two games and then just had to win one against a New England defense that was worse and decided to bench one of its better players for what reason we still haven't found out. Which was very bizarre and seemed to be a distraction. And it wasn't the first time that Belichick had done something like that, distracted his team with a strange benching. But aside from that, one trend that I'm noticing, and this is really just from responses from emails and Twitter mentions and things like that, is that the goodwill that Mike Zimmer had built up over not his fault that Blair Walsh shanked Not his fault that Teddy Bridgewater's knee fell apart and then overachieved in 2017 with Case Keenum as his quarterback. Some of that has deteriorated this year, where it's the first time that I'm hearing a ton of criticism of Zimmer that the offense is really on him as well because he's the head coach and he's the one that hired John DeFilippo, and that maybe some of the way that he's managed things throughout this year hasn't been the best. I don't necessarily buy into that myself because I think that he was put in a tough position with a quarterback who's been this way for a while and an inexperienced offensive coordinator. Maybe in hindsight they instead try to hire somebody else, but not his fault that Pat Shurmur got hired for a better job. What do you make of coaching as far as its value in terms of wins and losses, and how can we evaluate that objectively? Because oftentimes it becomes, I don't like, that he said this, or I don't like that decision on fourth down or something. Like we don't grade it necessarily on things that always make the most sense. So how would you go about that in an analytical fashion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I think that there's kind of two things that a coach can do. And we've seen it sort of a few different ways. So there's, like, in my opinion, like the Marvin Lewis kind of coach, a coach that can take you from being terrible to take you to being good, but may not be able to take you from good to Super Bowl caliber. I think that Zimmer has at least shown all of us that he's capable of that. The 2013 Vikings gave up 30 points a game. They were the worst team in the league in that regard. They're now a very respectable defense, very good defense, depending upon how you slice it. So, that's the case. And then there are other guys who can take you from being good to Super Bowl caliber, right? And the classic example, and I don't know how much of this is signal or noise, but Tony Dungy with Tampa Bay took them from being terrible to on the precipice, and then John Gruden was able to get them over the hump. There's been other examples of that in the past. Jimmy Johnson was able to do both with Dallas, for example. But, there's still a question as to whether Zimmer can really take them over the edge. And I think that, basically his disdain for the offensive side of the ball at times might have been his worst enemy because, he was very hands-off in the past. And I think his hands-offness kind of allowed the door to open for them to get somebody like Kirk when it was clear that he preferred Teddy. And I think that might be an issue for them moving forward. So, I don't know. I still think Zimmer's a terrific coach, and, the Vikings could do an awful lot worse, but there's still that question to remain, whether or not he's capable of putting them into that Super Bowl, because right now he's up against, the Sean McVays, the Andy Reids, the Bill Belichick's, those types of teams, which just appear to be simply like above the curve with respect to, taking great, good and making it great.
I tend to look at fan bases in the NFL as having something similar about almost all of them that aren't the Patriots, and that's that they really don't like their head coach or their offensive coordinator normally, right? It just goes across fan bases that they watch so much of it that you see every single little mistake that it's hard to kind of remove yourself from that and look at it as compared to the curve. And I think where I would put Zimmer is exactly the same. Is okay, he's not Belichick and he's not Sean McVay, and maybe McVay has had some advantages here when it comes to a lot of the personnel that he had made this all possible as well, with the offensive line and the weapons that they've put together and things like that. But maybe he's not in that category, but just a cut below. But is a cut below going to be good enough when you don't have that level of personnel on the offensive side? And I guess my question, somebody brought this up on Twitter, really interesting question, Eric, is can a defense-only coach, because it seems Zimmer wants to be so hands-off, can a defense-only coach have a consistent offense year after year after year when if you have a good year, your offensive coordinator usually gets another job, right? Like, is it even possible to count on what they're going to have on offense year after year if the head coach is going to rely solely on what his offensive coordinator is bringing?
Right. I mean, I think that when you've looked at, some of the great ones, McVay, for example, is mostly an offensive guy. But if you look at some of the great ones, Tomlin, certainly to the degree that, he's been great. He was very hands off on the defense to Dick LeBeau at first and was allowed to sort of intersperse himself. Belichick went from a defensive-minded coach to a guy who is basically now on the offensive side, it seems like at times. I don't know. It's tough because, again, like you can like sort of lose track of some like trends within a season, and we know that in the NFL adjustments are kind of like everything, right? So if you lose track of those, then probably you're going to have some difficulty, moving forward. And it seems like that's kind of been the case where, through 2 games, the Vikings were, a pretty good offense, and then Buffalo happened, right? I'm not sure necessarily if Zimmer was able to see that coming, right? They have a few good games in a row, and then Chicago happens, right? And Chicago has a bevy of things. They turn the ball over too much. They weren't able to, take advantage of it. The defense of Chicago, which is pretty good. It's just interesting to me that, like, you only focus on one, sort of silo of a football team. You oftentimes can miss things that if you were more big picture in your nature, you could sort of see.
It does feel like they have chased their tail this year, where every time, it's kind of like that game. Do kids go to, you have kids, do they go to like arcades anymore? Does that happen?
Yeah, Chuck E. Cheese is a thing.
Oh, okay, good. So everyone would understand then the game of whack-a-mole, right?
Yes, yes.
Or whatever. When one thing pops up for this team, they fix it, maybe, like on defense after the Rams game, but then some other problem pops up. And that problem has been that John DeFilippo, I think his inexperience may play into this, but has not found an offensive identity and has operated one of the, I think, least effective offenses in the entire NFL, which is stunning when you look at some of Kirk Cousins' numbers, but then when you look at how much they produce per drive in terms of yards and in terms of points, this team is not dangerous at all when it comes to the offensive side, especially when you look around the league and you see some of the more explosive offenses by comparison. I mean, this team, you can match them up against a team like Denver, and you'll see that they're pretty similar in how much they score. That is not something we expected long term. So I guess when you're talking about whether they could actually, go through a playoff series, that would likely mean you have to face coaches of the same caliber or better and hope that the offense magically gets it together when they haven't been able to do so consistently for the whole season.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that to me is sort of the mark of having, a situation where what you're relying on is pretty unstable, right? Defense is something that, as we have seen last week, the Vikings had to play with Marcus Sherrills, Holton Hill, and Mackenzie Alexander as their 3 defensive backs. None of those corners, so none of those guys started at cornerback week 1 for them, right? So it's a classic case. Okay, our defense is a little weaker. They were probably going to give up a score or 2 here in the third quarter. We need to match wits offensively. And, we saw sort of the comedy that sort of was their offense in the second half of that game. The offensive line has been a series of patchwork things. I'm assuming they expected Elflein to be a lot healthier than he was, going into the season. I think they expected Riley Reif to be a better player, at least an average player, against some of the more elite pass rushers in the league. And then, they just have really struggled. I don't think they meant for Brian O'Neill to play as solid as he's been so far. And then the receivers, I think that the faith was misplaced, but in cutting Jarius Wright, I'm assuming they thought that Treadwell would be a useful player this year. And again, any one of those things pop up a season ago, the Vikings seem to always have an answer, and a lot of that might have been luck a season ago. This year, not so much.
Lucky's 13 Pubs has you covered for the best game day experience this football season. Tons of TVs, legendary appetizers, amazing fresh half-pound burgers, handcrafted sandwiches, and a wide variety of other pub favorites. The drink menu is awesome, too. Huge selection of tap beer, handcrafted cocktails, and the best Bloody Marys in town. Seriously, these Bloodies are awesome. Try the Bacon Bloody, the Jalapeno Bloody, the Mother Mary, or just get a flight and try them all. Plus, Lucky's 13 celebrates Sunday Fun Day. Happy hour all day long on Sunday, every Sunday. Events and prize giveaways during games, too. Lucky's 13 has locations in Bloomington, Burnsville, Mendota, Plymouth, and Roseville. Having people over for the game? Call ahead to Lucky's and order some of those legendary apps, and they'll be ready to bring home when you get there. It's football time at Lucky's 13 Pubs. Find them online at luckys13pub.com. luckys13pub.com. It's the most wonderful time of the year, football time. And Lucky's 13 Pubs has you covered for the best game day experience. luckys13pub.com.
And, Dalvin Cook is part of that, too, where they miss him over a stretch and then have just not really been able to find any consistency in having big games with him. Even against Detroit, it's one big run, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And otherwise, they throw a couple screen passes to them. Some were effective, some weren't, but only a couple. Even against Green Bay, they throw him the ball 3 times. They check down to him a ton of times against the Patriots, but can't find him room and space. Is there something that you notice that the better teams are doing to maximize their running backs? Or do we just have kind of a Todd Gurley situation here when he was with Jeff Fisher, where it was the offense and the offensive line was really bad, and all those outside factors are going to take a great, great football player and make him a whole heck of a lot less effective?
Yeah, and that's the rough part about running back, because you look at, like, for example, James White, who, I love as a player, but, he's nothing special in terms of talent, making a ton of plays against the Vikings because he's being used in advantageous spots, right? So, like, the Vikings here have a plus talent at running back, and because they're sort of unable to get him into space, I think throwing the ball to Cook, which is something they did early in the season before he got injured, and then they have at times, for example, against Green Bay, I think that's really like the thing that they should be doing more than trying to run him up between the tackles, just because they simply can't, get the pass blocking done. I think with respect to the running game, it is very much similar to what you saw with Todd Gurley in 2016 with the Rams, which is unfortunate, but also something I think that they can learn from this offseason. I'm really interested to see in Seattle Monday if they try to run the ball more for its own sake, because I think that would be a mistake, but something that they've seemed to have hinted at this week.
Well, and Seattle is not particularly good against the run, and that's where this sort of conversation with the running game has been a little bit, I don't know, I guess I get frustrated with it because their run-pass ratio is worst in the league, and so you might think, well, I guess they've just got to run the ball more, but it's really, you need to get the lead more, and then when you have the lead, of course you can run the clock out and things like that, but it's been pretty obvious that their run-pass ratio has a lot to do with being down by 2 scores in a lot of games. Against Buffalo, they were down by a couple scores, and I think I look back at this a couple weeks ago that Cousins was number 1 in attempts when his team is down by 2 scores. So that's part of it. It's just I'm thinking a lot about where running backs just sit in our modern game here, Eric, because I watched the Patriots just do it brilliantly. And the Patriots, they've got like a Sam Gash, Lorenzo Neal style guy back there. I think I have a new player that, I don't have any like player jerseys since I became an adult. It's just, and especially a journalist.
You don't like to wear other people's clothes?
No, I know. I don't fault any fan who wants to buy a Vikings jersey, and tailgate and do that. Like, that's great. Have fun with that. But, as someone covering it, I'm not going to do something like that. But the fullback from New England, maybe. Like James Devlin was so much fun to watch because they kind of went old school there, and they used a lot of 2 running back sets, and they threw him a little 9-yard pass, and he plowed in from the 1-yard line. And I guess I'm not saying that the Vikings should use like C.J. Ham all the time. I guess I'm just thinking about all the interesting ways that Rex Burkhead comes in and he does a thing, and James White's in the slot. And if the Vikings are going to have Dalvin Cook, I just don't think they can use him as a regular running back. I think it has to be as this playmaker, sort of like the rich man's Cordero Patterson, where you can use him all over the field as a receiver or running back, throw it to him all the time. Don't just use this man as a regular running back who you throw the occasional screen to. Like, in order to have success with him, you're going to have to use him more creatively, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what the best offenses historically have done. Even like if you look at, you're for good reason very fond of Thurman Thomas, and there were times in Thomas's career where he was averaging, a little bit over 4 yards a carry for whatever reason. Maybe their offensive line was a little weak that year. Maybe, as you said, a lot of the run game, and you described this perfectly, is about game flow. If you're not ahead, right, you're not going to run the ball very much. It's just the way that it goes. So some years Thurman Thomas would only average 3.9, 3.8 yards a carry, but then he'd catch enough passes to add value, right? Some years I looked at Marshall Faulk. Marshall Faulk was brilliant for the St. Louis Rams, but he offered value by catching 86, 87, and 83. Like, he had 80 catches 5 consecutive seasons for the Rams as a running back. So, like, that I do think that's where, the current running back finds value. You're just simply not going to be able to, Jerome Bettis your way to winning football games the way that you were back in the day, right? Like Bettis didn't offer a whole lot except for 4 yards in a cloud of dust, and that was good enough, right? But nowadays, offensive lines aren't as good. Defensive linemen, there's no bigger mismatch athletically on the football field than a guy like Akeem Hicks versus a guy like Mike Remmers. So, you're just not going to be able to run between the tackles as much. And because, the games are higher scoring now too, there are going to be games where you're more behind, if you're an underdog than previously. So it's just not stacking up that way. And I do think if you have a guy like Dalvin Cook, you really do have to leverage his ability in the passing game, or you're not really getting what kind of value he can give.
The Steelers were so good with that. The Barry Foster to Bam Morris to Jerome Bettis. I mean,
yeah.
That's some ground and pound.
Amos Zaraway.
Yeah, he was like their change of pace back, even though he was just like a normal running back, but compared to those giant monsters. And then, you get Tommy Maddox and Bubby Brister. I'm probably mixing up my different times of when these guys played quarterback, but Neil O'Donnell, yeah. Cordell Stewart, man, he would have been good in today's age. So let me ask you a sort of like big around the league question here of just like, what's going to win? Not who necessarily, but the team that wins the Super Bowl is going to win because of what? And I ask this because last year sort of threw us off. You get Nick Foles comes in, and then it's, remember, you can win with any quarterback, which is not true, and they were 13-3 in part because of how great Carson Wentz was last season. But it sort of throws you back to, well, maybe scheme can win now. Maybe defense can win now. And everyone's always asking, is it a great defense that can win? Is it a great offense? It's sort of the question that's always existed. And, I mean, the real answer is both. But is there something this year that's sort of different when we've had these huge conversations about offense where you could see Dallas and what they did to New Orleans, like all of a sudden surprise everyone because they have this really good defense or something like that? Like what's going to win?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because I do think you can see one-off games like that Thursday night game with Dallas, and that will happen. And if Baltimore goes into Kansas City on Sunday and wins because of defense, again, will be another narrative. But to me, you're going to need to be able to take advantage of when opportunities strike and luck is given to you, right? So the thing about the Philadelphia Eagles a season ago was they were extremely lucky in terms of converting a lot of third and longs. They were extremely lucky in terms of converting fourth downs. They were extremely lucky in terms of, the way that their schedule aligned. They faced an Atlanta team. They could never get out of their own way last year or this year, frankly. They faced a Vikings team that gave them turnovers. And then they faced a New England team that, as you said, messed with their defense the day before the Super Bowl. You have to be able to take advantage of all those. Last season, Philly was something like 70% or on fourth downs. They took advantage of all their plus opportunities. Now, how do you do that? I think you do that by having quarterbacks like Drew Brees, Patrick Mahomes, Tom Brady, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, because, to me, that's how, you put up enough points to take advantage of situations that are given to you. And so those are the types of players and quarterbacks and teams that I think are going to be what wins, is those guys that are able to string together. And again, this comes back to Cousins, be able to string together just consecutive drives, consecutive plays, just big time plays that'll end up, distancing yourself from the other team, because close games are a coin flip. But if you can blow a team out with offense, that's really what you want.
Yeah, this year is going to be sort of a really interesting test case of how some of these offenses can operate in the playoffs, because we've seen it go any direction in the past where the great offenses get shut down. I kind of go back to sometimes the Giants beat the 49ers with Parcells and Walsh. Sometimes Walsh beat Parcells, and it was, it would go back and forth. And that's sort of what's great about football, is that it can be like that. But the consistent thing that we get, is you're going to have to get really good quarterback play. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be a Hall of Fame quarterback. And at total random, and Nick Foles had done this before in his career, he just played unbelievable football for 2 games, and that was all that it took. And that's what makes it super random. And in a lot of ways, I felt like it was a disappointing result because of that. Like, oh man, we got to see sort of this backup quarterback beat Brady. And then in another way, this is why every fan base shouldn't be bailing on their team when it comes to the end of the season, even if you're disappointed, because in 2012, the Ravens were in the same spot. They fired their offensive coordinator. Joe Flacco had one of the greatest runs in playoff history, and they win the Super Bowl because football's weird like that. So, anyway, Eric, before we wrap up, I wanted to kind of lean away from this Seahawks game on Monday night in this podcast because of just where people are with the conversation with the Vikings. But give me your take on what we should expect here. What is the biggest factor on whether the Vikings can actually beat a winning team, albeit just sort of another mediocre one?
Yeah, so the Seahawks, I think their fan base is interesting because the majority of them seem to have gone the opposite way of the Vikings. They gave up on the season before it started. And then now they have, I think, maybe undeserved optimism, whereas it's sort of been the complete opposite for Vikes fans. I don't know. This is interesting, right? Because this is a classic example where there is a clear advantage for one of the quarterbacks over another. Russell Wilson has the highest rate of what we call big time throws. So the throws that we give are, +1 or better grades to. He's a classic example of how less is more. Right? They've thrown less this year. They've protected him better. I think losing Tom Cable, getting a different offensive line coach in there has really helped. They don't have great receivers, but Tyler Lockett has really emerged. And I think he's the kind of speedy, small receiver that can give somebody like Xavier Rhodes and Trey Wayne, should he play, trouble, right, being taller guys. So I think that their offense is going to probably do what they want. When the Vikings struggle, they often struggle against the run, and the Seahawks commit to that quite a bit. Defensively, the Seahawks don't really have the big names they used to have, except for one, and Bobby Wagner is probably the best linebacker in the NFL. So I think a commitment to Cook this week might, even though be a good idea, not yield the results because Wagner might shut him down. But they're not as strong at corner as they used to be. So if the Vikings receivers are healthy, they might have a shot. I see it being kind of a close game, but ultimately, I don't know, probably 60-40, the Seahawks, would win in terms of percentage.
I do think that teams that play cover 3 against the Vikings are asking for trouble, though, don't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think that's partly, it used to be a cover 3 thing was a hack for them because they had such a brilliant free safety and linebackers who were, obviously Wagner's still there, and then corners that could really play that scheme. I think now it's more to cover things up. But yeah, the league it's no better look at how the league has evolved to sort of show the limitations of cover 3 in 2018. And as you said, against the Vikings, it's asking for trouble.
All right, Eric, as always, awesome stuff. Tell people where they can find your podcast.
Yeah, so the PFF Forecast is on Podcast One, as is this great podcast, and then also on iTunes. So yeah, give it a listen once you're done listening to the Purple Podcast. You also do YouTube videos and you tweet sometimes. I mean, it's amazing. We're all multi-platform. PFF_Eric is the Twitter handle. Yeah, I do tweet, and most of the time I'm half joking, although I can't. I actually, when the Vikings are playing, I don't know when the lines get blurred.
Yeah, I've seen you on multiple occasions frustrate the Purple faithful, but only usually with realistic expectations for certain things like, this season and all. But, we've talked about this a lot, though, and I don't feel like I told you so is sort of the right tone to take for us. And for, Courtney was talking about this, too, about the Super Bowl or bust thing, though. It was just really flawed. When we were talking about what we thought for this season, I think you came on and people got really upset with you for saying 9-7 was a realistic possibility, and here we are, and 10-6 was my pick, because I don't think any of us actually thought Super Bowl or bust was a real thing. But if you're a Viking fan and you see them spend what they spend on the quarterback, I don't blame anyone for saying, yeah, okay, well, this is what it should be if you guys are actually making this all-in move. I don't blame anyone for feeling that way.
No, you're right. I mean, so there's two different things. There's what what your wishes are as a fan. And then you and I mean, I grew up a Vikings fan, but ultimately I'm pretty, not engaged with that as a fan very much anymore. And so you just look at it and you say, okay, 8-8, 13-3 the last 2 years, split the difference between those two. Look at Cousins' history, right? Look at a tougher schedule. Schedule's been tougher than even we thought. And, it was just a rational approach to looking at it. And I think the difficulty is if you're a Vikings fan, you look at 13-3 and you see a new quarterback who's had some success in the NFL and you want, the worst thing, and this is why, it's important for people like you and me not to be fans. When you want something to be true, you'll find enough evidence for it to be true in your mind, right? So, for us too, if we thought the Vikings weren't going to be very good, we're going to try to find evidence to support that as well, right? So you really do have to have a level head, and I think ultimately we were, and during the season, they've had some ups and downs, but it's exactly sort of what we expected.
Yeah, and the ups and downs for me, that's a totally different perspective, is sort of fun to follow along and try to solve the problems and talk about them. But I imagine for a fan base that saw their team go to the NFC Championship, when you have this many ups and downs, it probably just breaks you at some point, and I think a lot of people are there. But you never know what can happen going forward, especially when you have this level of talent on defense. So I'm saying that we're not going to quite get into who to draft at right guard yet.
No, not yet.
It is not time for that. I got a bunch of tweets yesterday. Maybe you guys could talk about the offensive line and who they could draft. Not yet. We will.
Not yet.
Trust me, there will be plenty of time for that. So, Eric, awesome stuff as always, and we will talk to you all again soon on the Purple Podcast.
The Canopy Group would like to thank State Farm, American Family, and Liberty Mutual for all of their future notifications. These notifications are delivered every 6 months to your mailbox as your insurance bill. These insurance companies have the ability to increase your insurance premium every 6 months, and your agent can't do anything about it. Your agent has no options, just the one company. So if you go to your mailbox and open your 6-month policy to discover yet another significant premium increase, do not panic. Think Canopy Group. The Canopy Group has 16 different insurance companies for you, 16 different options. The Canopy Group offers only annual policies. That limits the insurance company's ability to increase your premium. They can only do it once a year rather than twice. Coming soon, another 6-month policy increase for you. Don't panic. Contact the Canopy Group at 800-967-3389 or go online to thecanopygroup.com.
Brexit debate. I'm Ed Donahue with an AP News Minute. British Prime Minister Theresa May has decided to delay a vote on Brexit in the House of Commons, arguing her government is in complete disarray. Voters in Britain decided to exit the European Union.
I think those people, many of whom voted for the first time at all or for the first time in decades when they voted in the referendum in 2016, will indeed question that, why should we vote in future?
The North Carolina National Guard is out helping people recover from a snowstorm, including relocating a baby from a snowed-in house. There have been lots of crashes in North Carolina.
The Highway Patrol, since this storm has started, has responded to 672 collisions and 1,571 calls for service from the onset of this storm.
The Trump administration has imposed sanctions on 3 senior North Korean officials for human rights abuses to call attention to censorship as well as the death of American Otto Warmbier. I'm Ed Donahue.